think we have any visitors today. And since I'm trying not to eat sweets, I will tell everybody there's brownies up here in the front. They didn't get passed out. When I'm not trying to be good, I'm not going to tell you that there's brownies in the front. So, but somehow they disappear. I don't know who does. This morning's sermon, maybe it's a better thing that we don't have visitors. This is a kind of a transition sermon. I had a really hard time this week trying to figure out what to talk about. Not because Daniel chapter 4 is where we're going to be, is a difficult passage or anything, but I just think there's some things that maybe I grew up in the church, and I didn't put certain things together sometimes until later. And so what I want us to do, what I want to make sure is that we all understand the context of where we are in Daniel chapter 4. And as we move forward, Elise asks me every day, are you going to talk about Esther today? Are you going to talk about Esther today? And I'm going to get there. Maybe by Christmas, we'll get there. But I want us to make sure we're looking at this. So just I like to review a little bit. Maybe that's the teacher in me. But we've been looking at Daniel chapter 1 through 3. And we know historically that Daniel 1, the first Daniel chapter 1, takes place around 607 or 605 BC. Depending on which historian you look at, some say 607, some say 605. And that is when Nebuchadnezzar becomes king of Babylon, when his father dies. And Nebuchadnezzar is probably in his early 20s. I've seen anywhere from 20 to 22 years old. He has been leading a campaign, and he hears that his dad has died. So he goes back to Babylon, and he takes over as king. And then we know in Daniel chapter 2, that it's the second full year, or the third year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, when Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So 607 minus 3, or 605 minus 3, we're looking at 604 to 602 BC, before Christ, when our time frame comes. Last week we talked about Daniel chapter 3, and when we look at Daniel chapter 3, we don't have a time frame. We don't know how long, what happened between Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 3. But we know that there has to have been a considerable amount of time between Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 3. If nothing else, he had to make a golden statue that was 90 feet tall. So that had to have taken time. So we don't know. We don't know how long there has been. Historians vary between how long they say it takes. But now in Daniel chapter 4, where we're at now, we read about the second time, or second recorded time, that Daniel is going to interpret a dream from Nebuchadnezzar. And again, we don't know how much time passes from chapters 2 to 4, and we don't know how much time passes from 3 to 4. But this event is probably taking place near the end of Nebuchadnezzar's 43-year reign. Nebuchadnezzar was king for 43 years. So he lived to be in about his mid to late 60s. That means that this is a good 30 years after Daniel chapter 2. So if Daniel was in his early 20s, now Daniel is around 50 years old, which is extremely young nowadays. Very young and energetic and a great time to be alive. Anyway, just throw that in there. But there's a big difference here. And the reason I say that, because Daniel was a teenager, and now he's lived most or a lot of his life, and now he's middle-aged almost, and this time he's getting old. He's getting up there. Not nowadays, but this time. So that's a big difference. Now, I'm going to go back and I'm going to show you a little bit of history. I hope that's okay to put this in context. If you haven't read chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar is going to go crazy in chapter 4. He's going to lose his senses. But I want to show why we think that this is in the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So, from historical standpoint, the Babylonians, they wrote down a lot of things. And there's a lot of ancient documents that we can go back and look at. And there's a lot of historians who wrote about the Babylonian Empire. Most of what we know about the Babylonian Empire takes place in the beginning of his reign. We don't know a lot about the end. Which, if you look at Daniel chapter 4, if he goes crazy for 7 years, then they're not going to write about that. I put this little line here at the bottom. History is written by the victors. Historically, if the Babylonians had lost the battle to the Egyptians, they're not going to put up a monument and say, oh, great, look at what we lost here. This is wonderful. They're not going to say anything, or they're not going to do anything. History, and some of you may not believe this, the writers of history also have a lot of propaganda in them, where they're pushing up how great and how wonderful they were. And so we have to take that with a grain of salt, but we also have to realize that at the end of his reign, we don't hear a lot about his victories, his accomplishments, his buildings, his monuments. We hear about it at the beginning, but not so much at the end. And I don't know how many lessons we're going to get to, but they have found, my number is correct here, 14 million bricks that Nebuchadnezzar wrote his name on every single brick, or had them write his name on every brick. And so when you walked up to Babylon, everything was in these bricks, and it all said, I don't remember exactly what it said, but I'm going to show you pictures of it. He also showed pictures of dinosaurs, but we'll get to that later. But he has all of that under because he wanted everybody to know who he was and who built that building. I'm going to talk more about that later. Anyway, now if we go to history, there is a 4th century historian named Eusebius. I don't know how he is. Now this is a little confusing because he writes about a historian who's quoting another historian that says that Nebuchadnezzar, this is what he's writing, having become more powerful than Hercules, if you remember the ancient myths there, he invaded Libya. Where's Libya? Africa. Nebuchadnezzar goes into Africa in 586 BC. Or is it? Well, I have it down there. And he conquers. I'm going to get to that later. Because Jeremiah prophesies about that, and that's what happens. But anyway, after he's conquered Libya and Iberia, and when he had rendered them tributary, he extended his conquest over the inhabitants of the shores up to the Riding Sea. It is moreover related by the Chaldeans that as he went up into his palace, after conquering all his people, he went up into his palace and he was possessed by some god. This is the Babylonians saying something happened to him. We don't know what, but it seems like he was possessed. And he cried out and said, O Babylonians, I, Nebuchadnezzar, foretell unto you a calamity which must shortly come to pass. He's going crazy. And he tells them the Persians are going to come and take over us. Guess what happens? That's what happens. How would he know that if he didn't go crazy, or if he didn't have his dream interpreted by Daniel? But this isn't even biblical. Like I did in this part, history has shown us that there is a tablet from ancient Babylon. And it's broken down here, and it has different lines. The right side of the tablet, I thought about putting a picture up, but it's not. You're not going to be able to see it too well. The right side of the tablet is real worn, so you can't read it. And some of the lines are real worn. But it says, line 2 says, Nebuchadnezzar considered, and we don't know what it says. Line 3, his life appeared of no value to him. And line 5, and the Babylonian speaks, had counsel to evil Marduk. Evil Marduk is his son. Number 6, then he gives an entirely different order, but we don't know what it says. He doesn't heed the words from his lips, the couriers. He doesn't show love to son or daughter. Family and clan do not exist. His attention was not directed towards promoting the welfare of Esagil, which is like a temple area, and Babylon. Then it skips a line. He prays to the Lord of hosts. He raised his hands in supplication. He weeps bitterly to Marduk, the great gods. His prayers go forth to... We don't know what it's talking about. We don't know everything that it's saying. But the interpretation of this, it seems clear from line 2 that the text refers to King Nebuchadnezzar. Lines 3, 6, 7, 11, 12, and 14 refer to an abnormal behavior of Nebuchadnezzar, which is being reported to his son and his heir, the guy who's going to become the next king, by couriers of the official palace records. So it has to be later on in his life, if he became king, let's say 20 or 22 years old, and his son is now able to reign, his son has to be probably in his 20s. So it's later on in his life, and they report to his son that his father, the king's life, appears of no value to him. His orders are contradictory. He's not in the palace. He's gone somewhere else. He doesn't listen to the palace couriers. He neglects his own sons and daughters. He's not performing his sacred religious duties as king at the most important temple complex in Babylon, which was called Esagil. And who's giving bad counsel to Evil Marduk in line 5? Could it be palace officials who counseled him to assume the throne entirely rather than merely serve as a regent during his father's incapacity? Lines 16 through 18 may refer to Evil Marduk's attempts to enlist the aid of Marduk, their god, their principal god, and it seems that his prayers are going answered. But this document seems to indicate that something abnormal happened to King Nebuchadnezzar, which coincides with what happens in Daniel chapter 4. Now, I'm not saying that's, and I'm quoting a lot of this from a website called BibleReadingArchaeology.com. And it says, in this text, something is seriously wrong with Nebuchadnezzar. And nobody, least of all his son and his heir, knows what to do about it. The gods are not listening. And there's a definite tone of desperation in the text. We are listening in as those who are in the know discuss a deep, dark palace secret. Both of those accounts seem to indicate that Nebuchadnezzar has a time in his life where things are just not right, which is exactly what Daniel 4 tells us. And we're going to get there. But I also want us to go back and look at a few things here. Because we are trying to get to Esther eventually, Rosie. But if you look at this, where we're at, the different conquests, we're in this stage right in here. Daniel chapter 4 is going to take place right in here somewhere before the Persians conquer Babylon. And that battle and that fight is really very interesting. Esther is going to be about 65 years away. So it won't take us that long to get to Esther, but it's going to seem like it. We're going to eventually get there. But I wanted just to let you know where we're at in the timeline. But also, when we look at this, this is a map or a timeline of the Babylonian captivity. We know it's going to last 70 years. This chart says it from 607 to 538. Daniel chapter 4 being here closer to the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign before his sons take over. This is Daniel chapter 2, 3, 4, those things. But what I wanted to really point out to you was this. And this is something that I never dawned on me until recently. Daniel, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are all contemporaries. They're all preaching and teaching at the same time, but they're just in different places. And so those books, when they're put together in the Old Testament, it's because they were all working, doing what God had asked them to do. And then you can look at some of the Old Testament books that are before the exile, and then the books that are written after the exile. Which, when you read those books, and maybe we're going to get to those one of these days, it makes a lot of sense as to when they were written, because it makes more sense about what you're reading. Robert asked me to read, I think it was Zechariah chapter 14 the other day. Well, it makes a lot more sense when I realize he's writing that after the exile. What he's writing is not about what's going to happen here, but it's what's going to happen in the future, which has a lot more meaning to it, as opposed to some of the other books. But this one is also, I think this is the last one of these little pictures that I want to go to. I want us to make sure that we get this, that Jeremiah is in Jerusalem. Jeremiah preaches for a long time. But even when the Babylonians come in 605 or 607 and they take some of the people away, Jeremiah is still preaching. He's ministering to all the people. Even during the 3 different times that the Jews revolt against Babylon, Jeremiah stays there. When the Jews get scared of the Babylonians and run to Egypt, Jeremiah runs to Egypt with them. Ezekiel is going to be in Babylon, but he's going to be ministering to the people who are in exile. And Daniel is ministering in Babylon, but he's a really high court official. He's an important bigwig in the government. I would say vice president, but that's a totally bad example. But he's high up. So I want us to look a little bit at these different individuals. So we know where we're at historically in this. And I say all this because I don't have like a real great point at the end. You're like, wow, what a great sermon. It's just going to be a lot of information. Hope everybody's okay with that. So Jeremiah began prophesying before the fall of Judah in 626 BC. And he continues through the 3 exportations and going into Egypt into about 586 BC for a total of 40 years. That's a long time to be prophesying, to be ministering, to be preaching, and trying to be teaching. His message was primarily about the destruction of Judah and the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's speaking to the Jews who are in Jerusalem, the Jews who are in Judah. That's who his message primarily is for. He's also known as the weeping prophet. And he, more than likely, not everybody's 100% sure he wrote the book of Lamentations. I feel confident he did. But it's a lament, it's a cry. He is physically there when he sees what happens in Jerusalem, and it makes him sad. He's hurt by that. And he writes the book of Lamentations. But I found this interesting. Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 2 through 4. The Babylonians have now come. This is the 3rd time that they've come through. And Jeremiah 40, verse 2 says, and the captain of the guard took Jeremiah and said to him, the captain of the Babylonian guard says to Jeremiah, the Lord your God has pronounced this doom on this place. Now, I want to stop there for just a second. Because at this time, Daniel is a Jew or an Israelite, and he is super high up in the Babylonian government. Daniel has interpreted dreams for King Nebuchadnezzar. And I just wondered, did the captain of the guard, does he know that? Does he know who Daniel is? Has he heard about God? Because he's confessing to Jeremiah. He knows what Jeremiah has been preaching. He says, the Lord your God has pronounced this doom on this place. Your God told you guys that this is what's going to happen. The Lord has brought it and has done just as he said. Your God is doing just what he said he was going to do. Because you people have sinned against the Lord and not obeyed his voice. Therefore this thing has come upon you. And now look, I free you this day from the chains that were on your hand. If you go back to Jeremiah, the people who had chained him up was the Judean king, Jehoiakim. He had locked him up. He had chained him up. And the Babylonians free him. And he tells him, if it seems good to you, come back with me to Babylon. Come with me and I'll take care of you. This is the captain of the guard saying that. But if it seems wrong for you to come with me to Babylon, remain here. See, all the land is before you. Wherever it seems good to go or convenient for you to go, you go wherever you want. We are setting you free to do whatever you want to do. And you know what Jeremiah does? He stays with the Jews in Jerusalem. The ones who have been taken over and killed and gone through horrendous actions. Jeremiah doesn't go to where there's safety in Jerusalem. He stays with the people. And then, as he goes with the people, he goes with them to Egypt. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read all of this, and I don't remember which line I underlined. But in Jeremiah 43, when they get to Egypt, then this is what I had underlined, I think. Jeremiah says, "This is what the Lord of the heavens, armies, the God of Israel says, I will certainly bring my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, here to Egypt." And Jeremiah put some stones underneath the ground, and he says, King Nebuchadnezzar is going to come right here, and he's going to set up his throne right here in Egypt. Because you Jews have left and you haven't done what I asked you to do, you're going to be punished, and Egypt is going to be punished. And when I asked earlier, where's Libya? It's in Africa. In 567 BC, towards the end of Nebuchadnezzar's life, he goes and he sets up his throne in Egypt. He does exactly what Jeremiah says that he's going to do. And we know that, 567 BC, because the Babylonians wrote about it, and wrote about their conquering of Egypt. Now, we also have Ezekiel. Ezekiel was more than likely deported from Jerusalem to Babylon during the second deportation. Daniel was gone in the first, 605. Daniel's a little bit older than Ezekiel. But we know that Ezekiel has a wife, that he has a house, and he has a relatively free existence. And his message is to the exiles in Babylonian captivity. He's the one speaking to the people that are there, and he tells them, don't try to go back to Jerusalem because it's going to be destroyed. He tells them, live at peace here in Babylon. We're going to be here. Jeremiah says you're going to be in exile for 70 years. But he tells them, continue to serve God. Just live through this. After Jerusalem falls, then he has a message of hope, of revival, and restoration. Not only to them, but foreshadowing what Jesus is going to do in the future. Two of the passages, this is also something I found very interesting. Ezekiel, and I put knew of Daniel. I think Ezekiel knew Daniel. Because I think Daniel, even though Daniel is a high Babylonian official, my gut feeling, the Bible doesn't say this, is that he still served God. And he still got together with Jews on the Sabbath. And he worshiped. And he praised God. And he knew who Ezekiel was. And he knew who those other followers of God were. Ezekiel 28, 2 through 4. He's making a statement here. He says, son of man, give the prince of... He's making a prophecy here. The prince of Tyre, this message from the sovereign Lord. In your great pride you claim, I am God. I sit on the divine throne in the heart of the sea. But you're only a man. You're not a God. You regard yourself as wiser than Daniel. They're contemporaries. Daniel is in the high court. And Ezekiel is saying, you think you're smarter than Daniel. What does that tell us what they think about Daniel? They think a lot of Daniel. They think very highly of Daniel. Ezekiel 14, 13 through 14. It says, son of man, when a land sins against me by persistent unfaithfulness, I will stretch out my hand against it. I will cut off its supply of bread, send famine on it, and cut off man and beast from it. When you're unfaithful to me, all of these bad things are going to be happening to you. But even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were there, they wouldn't be able to deliver you. They can only deliver themselves. Why is Ezekiel including Noah and Job with Daniel? Because he's held in high esteem. Because he's somebody that the Jewish people in exile look up to as a righteous person. So either he knew Daniel or he knows of Daniel as he's writing these things. Two, I'm not going to go into a lot of these, but two of the, what I consider most popular prophecies that Ezekiel makes. One of them, he talks about being a watchtower and being a guard in a watchtower. And he says, if I'm the guard in a watchtower and I tell the people that the enemy is coming and they don't listen, it's their fault. They're the ones that suffer for that. But if I'm the guard in the watchtower and I don't tell the people that the enemy is coming, I'm at fault because I didn't tell anybody. And God is telling Ezekiel, you're the watchtower. But I also think God is telling us, we are the people in the watchtower. If we don't go and tell other people about Jesus Christ and they're lost, then God can hold that against us. But if we go and warn other people and tell them and they don't accept, then we've done our job. And that's what God is telling Ezekiel here. There's also another prophecy where God takes Ezekiel out and he sees bones laying all over. Which both of these prophecies I think are very important when you look at it in context, because he's talking to people who have seen death and murder and seen enemies coming. And he sees all these bones and God tells him, do you think these bones can come back to life? And he says, I want you to tell the bones to come back to life. And he does. In verse 7, Ezekiel says, so I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a noise and a sudden rattling, and the bones came together, bone to bone. Indeed, as I looked, the sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them over, but there was no breath in them. But then, in verse 10, he says, then I prophesied again, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. Now, I say this because God is giving Ezekiel a message of hope. He's basically saying, all you guys see is dead bones. All you see is life that's emptiness. All you see is life that is falling apart. But I'm telling you, I'm God, and I can bring this all back. And I can bring back an army even greater than whatever was there before. And God is showing his power and his ability, which would have related to the people who had seen a lot of these things happen. So, part of my point here then is Jeremiah stayed with the Israelites who remained in Jerusalem and he preached the message. Ezekiel stayed in Babylon and preached and encouraged the exiles. Daniel was a high-ranking Babylonian official who was known and admired by the exiles. Do you think it made them feel good to know that somebody high up in government was just like me? Was it a Christian per se? 3 men of God, chosen by God for different purposes, and their message was to reach different audiences. They're working at the same time, but they're working in different areas and in different places. Because God is working. Even though this is one of the worst times in the history of God's people, God is still working. He worked in the life of Daniel. He worked in the life of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's working in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar. He's working in the life of Jeremiah. He's working in the life of Ezekiel. And God is working in countless other individuals' lives at the same time that we don't have recorded in the Bible. And so sometimes when things just seem to fall apart and we think our world is falling apart or our country is falling apart, we have to remember that God has a plan. God knows what he's doing and why he's doing it. And God's plan from the beginning was to bring salvation to the lost, to redeem us and to bring us back into a relationship with him. So even now when we look at things and we think, oh, all of these things that are happening that are horrible, we may not see it, and we may not know what's going on, but God is still at work. And I think sometimes even in the New Testament we lose focus. We look at all the things that Paul has done or Paul did in the New Testament, but we forget there were at least 10 other apostles. We don't know where they went or what they did, but they were spreading the gospel. They were preaching and they were teaching. We have recorded the message to the Gentiles, but there was a lot of other people who were working to bring about God's plan of salvation to the lost that we don't even hear about. Tonight we're going to talk about 3 people that you've probably never heard about, who God used to share the gospel. Got one more slide after this. I don't get too ready. Just like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, we have to do what God tells us to do. We have to remain faithful to God regardless of what is happening in the world around us. And we cannot lose our hope. We cannot lose our trust. We cannot lose our faith. I'm going to ask you to turn to the Song of Invitation real quick. 892. And I asked, I guess Dan, through Rusty, to lead this song for us. And I didn't care where he put it, but putting it at the end is actually better here. Because I want you to look at this, and I don't know if you've ever known this before. It doesn't even say it in this book. But this song comes from Lamentations chapter 3, 21 through 26. What's happening in Lamentations 3, 21 through 26? The destruction of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah is sitting there and he's seeing, and if you want to, go to the book of Lamentations, chapter 3, because right before all of that, in the chapter, it's talking about all the bad things that have happened to God's people. And Jeremiah has been a witness to the pain and the suffering and the evil that has been done to them. But in verse 22, notice the punctuation here. It says, but this I call to mind. All of these bad things are happening. All of these horrible things are happening. But I remember this, and because of what I remember, I have hope. And notice the colon there. The colon there is all of these things are what he's calling to mind, and all of these things are what give him hope. I do not have the voice like that, so I'm not going to try to sing this. But you can read it. And he says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. While death and destruction and evil seem to be prevailing in the world, Jeremiah says, I can have hope because I know that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. And the Lord's mercies, never come to an end. They don't come to an end because they're new every morning, and great is God's faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. And because of that, I have hope in Him. Even though physically, even though everything I see is falling apart, I still have hope in God. Verse 25 says, for the Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the soul who seeks Him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. This is the middle of a lament, a song of sadness. And he can say, God is not going to let us down. Even though Jerusalem is destroyed and the vast majority of the people are killed or taken into captivity, I'm not going to lose faith or hope in God. That's the way we need to be. I'm not trying to say things are going to fall apart in our world or in our country or any of that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that. But sometimes we go through points in our life where we feel like everything is falling apart and the world is just, I have no hope. Everything is just horrible. I think we need to look at some of the passages, look at Lamentations, look at Psalms, look at some of the other passages of encouragement and realize that even in times of horrendous difficulty, God is still in control. God is still working. God is still involved in the lives of other individuals. Even though we may not see it, God is working. If there is anything that we can do for you this morning on a spiritual basis, please come forward as Dan leads us in this song of invitation.